I was 19, wild and restless, thumbing my way back to our Oklahoma house after a night out that left me stranded, my phone dead, my friends gone. The highway stretched dark and empty, headlights rare, and I'd had too many drinks to care. Hitchhiking seemed smart until the buzz wore off. Then a rig rumbled up, brakes hissing, and I squinted, recognizing the beat-up cab, my stepdad, Ray, a 60-year-old trucker with a gravel voice and hands that had hauled more than freight. Mom was off on a work trip, some sales thing, leaving us solo for 2 weeks. Her last text a gruff bet I'd stay safe, way off. He rolled down the window, leaned out, his faded flannel open over a tight tee, gray hair sticking out under his cap, and growled I'd grown up, bet I'd get myself killed out here. I grinned, wobbly, climbed into the cab, my shorts riding up, tank top loose, the beer still humming in my veins. He smirked, pulled back onto the road, tires humming, saying I looked like trouble, bet I'd planned this mess. I bumped his arm with my elbow, flirty, saying trouble was my ride, bet he'd pick me up every time. He grunted, his hands tightening on the wheel, knuckles scarred from years on the haul, and said picking was his curse, bet I'd owe him big for this. I laughed, leaned closer, my shoulder grazing his, teasing that owing was my spark, bet he'd cash it quick. The cab rattled, headlights cutting the dark, and I shifted, my knee brushing his thigh, saying he looked hot driving, bet he'd hauled wilder loads than me. He smirked, flicked the radio low, some twangy tune buzzing, and said loads didn't flirt, bet I'd wreck this rig. I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying wrecking was my vibe, bet he'd steer it anyway. He glanced over, his hand brushing mine as I fiddled with the dash, teasing, muttering steering was my trap, bet I'd reel him off course. I grinned, bumped his knee, saying reeling was my rush, bet he'd swerve for me. The road stretched, stars poking through, and I leaned back, my arm brushing his sleeve, saying he was too steady, bet he'd shake if I pushed. He smirked, shifted gears, his elbow nudging my side, and said shaking was my chaos as bet I'd tip this truck. I bumped his shoulder, teasing, saying tipping was my thrill, bet he'd hold it up. He smirked, his hand brushing my wrist as he adjusted the wheel, muttering holding was my game, bet I'd drag him down. I laughed, flirty, saying dragging was my win, bet he'd follow anyway. The cab smelled of oil and leather, the beer fading slow, and I grabbed a water from the cooler, sipping, saying he looked damn good out here, bet he'd driven crazier nights. He smirked, took it, his fingers grazing mine, teasing, and sipped, saying nights didn't sass, bet I'd spin this one wild. I bumped his hip with mine, flirty, saying spinning was my spark, bet he'd turn it too. He leaned closer, his knee pressing mine, muttering turning was my hustle, bet I'd crank him out. I grinned, bumped his elbow, teasing, saying cranking was my play, bet he'd rev it back. The highway hummed, the rig rocking, and I stretched, my tank top shifting, saying he was too chill, bet he'd flare if I dared him. He smirked, his hand brushing my shoulder as he adjusted his cap, light, teasing, and said flaring was my mess, bet I'd blaze this road. I bumped his chest with my elbow, flirty, saying blazing was my rush, bet he'd burn with me. He smirked, turned the radio up, his arm grazing mine, muttering burning was my trap, bet I'd light him up. I grinned, leaned in, my knee brushing his thigh, teasing, saying lighting was my win, bet he'd glow anyway. The night rolled on, the cab warm, and I stayed there, saying he was too good at this, bet he'd chase my spark. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the seat, teasing, saying chasing was my game, bet I'd hook him tight. I laughed, bumped his shoulder one last time, flirty, knowing I'd snagged him, highway dark, tension bright point 2 days after Ray scooped me off the highway. I was still buzzing from that cab ride, his gruff tease looping in my head, too close, too sharp for a stepdad's vibe. Mom was still off on her work trip, her last text a horse bet I'd stay out of trouble, way wrong. I wandered into the garage that morning, barefoot in a loose tee and cutoffs, the air thick with grease and dust. Ray was hunched over his truck's cab, wiping down the dash, his faded flannel open over a tight tank, arms flexing as he scrubbed, cap tipped back. He didn't turn, just grunted I'd better not touch, bet I'd trash it fast. I grinned, leaned on the fender near him, my elbow brushing his side, flirty, saying he looked hot cleaning, bet he'd hauled dirtier rigs than this. He smirked, swiped the rag, and said rigs didn't flirt, bet I'd stall this one out. I slid closer, my hip nudging the truck's edge, teasing that flirting was my fuel, bet he'd rev it up anyway. He glanced over, his hand brushing a wrench by my arm, fingers tapping close, and said revving was my dodge, bet I'd spin him off track. I bumped his shoulder with mine, flirty, saying spinning was my spark, bet he'd crank it too. He smirked, turned the rag, his elbow grazing mine, muttering sparking was my mess, bet I'd owe him for this shine. I stepped up, my knee brushing his leg, and grabbed a spare rag, wiping a smudge slow, teasing that owing was my angle, bet he'd cash it with that grin. He took it, his fingers lingering on mine, teasing, and said cashing was my hustle, bet I'd con him into more. I bumped his hip, flirty, saying conning was my kick, bet he'd bite every turn. He smirked, leaned in, his arm brushing my side, muttering biting was my play, bet I'd hook him too tight. I grinned, tapped the wrench near his hand, teasing, saying hooking was my rush, bet he'd tug back sharp. The garage hummed, tools clanking, and I leaned on the cab door, my shoulder brushing his chest, saying he looked damn good greasy, bet he'd driven wilder hauls than this. He smirked, wiped his brow, his arm nudging mine, and said hauls didn't sass, bet I'd wreck this load. I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying wrecking was my vibe, bet he'd patch it anyway. He shifted, his hand brushing my arm as he grabbed a cloth, rough and warm, teasing, saying patching was my trap, bet I'd drag him off route. I smirked, pressed my knee against his, teasing, saying dragging was my thrill, bet he'd steer me home. He stood, stretching, his chest close as he tossed the cloth down, saying I'd better watch it, bet I'd tangle this garage. I smirked, bumped his hip with mine, and grabbed a soda from the bench, cracking it slow, teasing that tangling was my spark, bet he'd crack one too. He took it, his fingers brushing mine, teasing, and sipped, muttering cracking was my mess, bet I'd spill it first. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying spilling was my win, bet he'd mop it up. He smirked, leaned on the cab, his elbow brushing my side, teasing, saying mopping was my dream, bet I'd soak him instead. The sun sank, shadows creeping, and I stayed close, sipping, saying he looked too steady, bet he'd shake if I pushed him. He smirked, turned, his hand brushing my shoulder as he adjusted his cap, light, teasing, and said shaking was my chaos, bet I'd tip this truck. I grinned, bumped his chest with my elbow, flirty, saying tipping was my rush, bet he'd hold it anyway. He smirked, leaned in, his knee pressing mine, muttering holding was my hustle, bet I'd slip quick. I bumped his hip, teasing, saying slipping was my play, bet he'd catch me sharp. The garage dimmed, dusk settling, and I stepped back, tossing the can, saying he was too good at this, bet he'd chase my spark. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the fender, teasing, saying chasing was my trap, bet I'd reel him too far. I grinned, bumped his shoulder one last time, flirty, saying reeling was my win, bet he'd bite it hard. He turned, rag swinging, tension humming, and I knew I'd snagged him, grease on, game up. 4 days after the garage tease, the Oklahoma sun was brutal, baking the front porch where I lounged on the steps, barefoot in a loose tank and shorts, sipping a soda, the air thick with heat and dust. Mom was still off on her work trip, her last call a gravelly bet I'd keep it chill, dead wrong. I'd been replaying Ray's sharp smirks, his casual brushes, and it was sinking deeper than I'd let on. He came out, lugging a spare tire from the shed, his faded flannel tied around his waist, jeans low, sweat streaking his tight tee. He dropped it, grunting I'd better not roll it, I bet I'd wreck his stash. I grinned, kicked a pebble his way, flirty, saying he looked sexy hauling, bet he'd towed heavier loads than that. He smirked, wiped his hands, and said loads didn't flirt, bet I'd bust this one fast. I stood, sauntered over, my hip brushing the tire as I leaned in, teasing that flirting was my gear, bet he'd shift it anyway. He glanced up, his hand brushing the rim near my knee, fingers tapping close, and said shifting was my dodge, bet I'd spin him off. I bumped his shoulder with mine, flirty, saying spinning was my spark, bet he'd turn it too. He smirked, twisted a lug nut, his elbow grazing my arm, muttering sparking was my mess, bet I'd owe him for this haul. I stepped closer, my knee nudging his leg, and grabbed a lug wrench from the grass, twirling it slow, saying owing was my hook. Bet he'd crank it tight. He took it, his fingers brushing mine, teasing, and said cranking was my hustle. Bet I'd con him into more. I bumped his hip, flirty, teasing that conning was my kick. Bet he'd bite every twist. He smirked, leaned in, his arm brushing my side, muttering biting was my play. Bet I'd reel him too deep. I grinned, tapped the tire near his hand, saying reeling was my rush. Bet he'd tug back hard. The sun blazed, heat rising, and I leaned on the tire, my shoulder brushing his chest, saying he looked damn good out here. Bet he'd rolled hotter days than this. He smirked, wiped his brow, his arm nudging mine, and said days didn't sass. Bet I'd scorch this porch. I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying scorching was my vibe. Bet he'd fan it anyway. He shifted, his hand brushing my arm as he grabbed a rag, rough and warm, teasing, saying fanning was my chaos. Bet I'd blaze out quick. I smirked, pressed my knee against his, flirty, saying blazing was my thrill. Bet he'd burn with me. He stood, stretching, his chest close as he tossed the rag down, saying I'd better cool it. Bet I'd wreck this piece. I smirked, bumped his hip with mine, and grabbed a water from the step, sipping slow, teasing that wrecking was my spark. Bet he'd patch it up. He took it, his fingers grazing mine, teasing, and sipped, muttering patching was my trap. Bet I'd bust it first. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying busting was my win. Bet he'd fix it anyway. He smirked, leaned on the tire, his knee brushing mine, muttering fixing was my game. Bet I'd drag him in. The sky flared orange, dusk creeping, and I stayed close, saying he looked too steady. Bet he'd shake if I pushed him. He smirked, turned, his hand brushing my shoulder as he adjusted his cap, light, teasing, and said shaking was my mess. Bet I'd tip this yard. I grinned, bumped his chest with my elbow, flirty, saying tipping was my rush. Bet he'd hold it up. He smirked, leaned in, his arm nudging my side, muttering holding was my hustle. Bet I'd slip anyway. I bumped his hip, teasing, saying slipping was my play. Bet he'd catch me sharp. The porch creaked, night falling, and I stepped back, tossing the can, saying he was too good at this. Bet he'd chase my spark. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the tire, teasing, saying chasing was my trap. Bet I'd reel him too far. I grinned, bumped his shoulder one last time, flirty, saying reeling was my win. Bet he'd bite it hard. He turned, tire rolling, tension thick, and I knew I'd hooked him. Sweat on, stakes high. 3 days after the porch tease, the Oklahoma night hung heavy, the living room glowing soft under a flickering bulb as I slouched on the couch, legs stretched across the cushions, flipping through channels. Mom was still off on her work trip, her last text a scratchy. Bet I'd stay out of chaos, way off. I'd been feeding off Ray's gruff jabs, his sharp looks, and it was digging deeper than I'd planned. He shuffled in from the hall, 2 coffees in hand, his faded flannel swapped for a loose tee, jeans slung low, hair still damp from a shower. He dropped one on the table near me, his fingers brushing the mug as I grabbed it, grunting I'd better not spill. Bet I'd trash this rug. I smirked, swung my legs down, flirty, saying he looked cool brewing. Bet he'd pour me wild. He smirked, sank into the recliner across, his knee nudging the table's edge, and said wild wasn't coffee. Bet I'd talk it flat. I leaned forward, my elbow brushing his arm as I set the mug down, teasing that talking was my fuel. Bet he'd sip it anyway. He sipped his own, his hand brushing the remote near mine, teasing back, saying sipping was my dodge. Bet I'd reel him dry. I bumped his knee with my foot, flirty, saying reeling was my spark. Bet he'd brew it up. He smirked, shifted closer, his arm stretching across the table, muttering brewing was my hustle. Bet I'd burn this night. The coffee steamed, warm in my hands, and I slid to the couch edge, my knee grazing his, saying he looked damn good unwinding. Bet he'd hauled hotter nights than this. He smirked, leaned in, his hand brushing my shoulder as he grabbed the remote, light, teasing, saying hot didn't flirt. Bet I'd crank this tame. I grinned, bumped his elbow, flirty, saying cranking was my vibe. Bet he'd turn it sharp. He clicked the TV up, some old road flick humming, his arm resting near mine, muttering turning was my trap. Bet I'd flip it quick. I bumped his hip with my knee, teasing, saying flipping was my rush, bet he'd steady me anyway. He leaned back, sipping slow, his eyes flicking to me, saying I'd better ease up, bet I'd spin this room out. I smirked, bumped his shoulder with mine, flirty, and took a long sip, teasing that spinning was my spark, bet he'd roll with it. He smirked, he shifted, his hand brushing my wrist as he set his mug down, muttering rolling was my game, bet I'd drag him too far. I grinned, leaned in, my elbow pressing his side, flirty, saying dragging was my thrill, bet he'd tag along tight. He smirked, his fingers tapping near mine, teasing, muttering tagging was my win, bet I'd snag him raw. The TV droned, tires screeching low, and I stretched, my arm brushing his chest, saying he looked too chill, bet he'd flare if I pushed him. He smirked, leaned closer, his hand brushing my shoulder, light, teasing, saying flaring was my mess, bet I'd tip this couch. I bumped his knee, flirty, saying tipping was my play, bet he'd hold it up. He shifted, his hand sliding to my elbow, warm, muttering holding was my fantasy, bet I'd slip fast. I smirked, bumped his chest with my elbow, teasing, saying slipping was my rush, bet he'd catch me anyway. The night deepened, the bowl buzzing, and I stayed close, sipping, saying he was too good at this, bet he'd chase my spark. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the cushion, teasing, saying chasing was my trap, bet I'd reel him too deep. I grinned, bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying reeling was my win, bet he'd bite it hard. He smirked, leaned in, his arm brushing my back, muttering biting was my hustle, bet I'd twist him out. I laughed, teasing, bumped his hip, saying twisting was my game, bet he'd play it sharp. The house creaked, tension thick, and I leaned back, saying he looked too steady, bet he'd shake if I dared. He smirked, turned, his hand brushing my knee, light, teasing, and said shaking was my chaos, bet I'd tip this night. I grinned, bumped his chest one last time, flirty, saying tipping was my spark, bet he'd light it up. He didn't pull away, just watched, coffee cooling, and I knew I'd hooked him, mugs down, stakes high. The night after the bar run, Mom was due back from her work trip, her flu finally fading. But I'd lost the plot after 2 weeks of flirty games with Ray in our Oklahoma house. Her last text was a weak bet I'd kept it clean, wildly off. We'd stumbled home past 3 a.m., buzzed from bar beers, the truck weaving as I'd laughed, teasing he'd danced too sharp, bet he'd spin us out just to crow. He'd smirked, parked rough, and we'd spilled inside, the house dark, my head swimming from booze and his vibe. I'd felt it all night, his grip, his heat, and I wasn't dropping it. Barefoot in my skirt and top, I swayed in the hall, peeling off my jacket, flirty, saying he'd ruled that floor, bet he'd roll me too. He smirked, kicked the door shut, his jacket hitting the floor, leaving him in that tight tee, jeans low, and stepped up, muttering ruling was my hustle, bet I'd crash it quick. I grinned, lurched closer, my hip brushing his, teasing that crashing was my prize, bet he'd grab it anyway. He grabbed my wrists, light, tugging me toward his room, growling I'd gone too far, bet I'd sink us now. I laughed, flirty, bumped his chest with my shoulder, saying sinking was my spark, bet he'd dive in too. He smirked, pushed the door wide, his hand brushing my arm, steering me in, muttering diving was my trap, bet I'd snag him tight. The room was dim, lamp casting shadows, and I spun, dropping onto his bed, my skirt hiking up a bit, teasing, saying he looked hot chasing, bet he'd catch me here. He smirked, sank beside me, his knee nudging mine, hands hovering near my hips, light, teasing, saying catching was my mess, bet I'd twist him out. I grinned, shifted closer, my shoulder grazing his chest, flirty, saying twisting was my vibe, bet he'd roll with it. He leaned in, his hand brushing my waist, warm through my top, muttering rolling was dumb, bet I'd tip us over. I bumped his elbow, teasing, saying tipping was my rush, bet he'd steady me anyway. The bed creaked, beer buzzing in my veins, and I stretched back, my top slipping up an inch, flirty, saying he was too steady, bet he'd shake for this. He smirked, shifted closer, his knee pressing mine, one hand brushing my side, light, teasing, growling shaking was my chaos, bet I'd drag him down. I grinned, bumped his hip, my fingers grazing his arm, saying dragging was my thrill, bet he'd hold on tight. His hand slid to my elbow, pulling me nearer, his breath rough, muttering holding was my game, bet I'd pull him too far. I smirked, leaned up, my chest brushing his, flirty, saying far was my win, bet he'd chase it sharp, the air snapped, tension thick, and I giggled, teasing, saying he looked damn wild, bet he'd take it all. He smirked, his hand brushing my shoulder, tugging me closer, light, warm, growling wild was my spark, bet I'd blaze him out. I bumped his chest, my knee brushing his thigh, flirty, saying blazing was my rush, bet he'd fan it anyway. His grip tightened, his other hand sliding to my hip, teasing, his voice low, muttering fanning was my trap, bet I'd burn him raw. I grinned, my fingers tapping his chest, flirty, saying burning was my play, bet he'd fall for it. Then headlights flared, the front door slammed, Mom's voice cutting sharp, yelling where we were, back a day early. I froze, rolled off, yanking my top down, heart pounding, muttering she's here, bet we're done. Ray jumped up, smoothing his shirt, cursing, saying timing was hell, bet she'd flip out clean. I stumbled to the hall, Mom storming in, bags dropping, eyes wild, screaming what the hell of me in his room, drunk? I stammered it was nothing, bet she'd blow it up. She grabbed my arm, yelling at Ray he'd crossed it, pack his junk, we're out, she hauled me to my room, threw my stuff in a bag, her hands trembling, shouting we're leaving, now. Ray stood in the hall, saying I'd lit it, bet she'd see my spark, but she shoved past, dragged me to the car, tires screeching as we peeled out, leaving him glaring. I slumped, buzzed dead, knowing I'd fired it, bet it torched us all after the bar. Mom's return loomed, her work trip ending early, her last text a horse bet I'd stayed tame, way off. We'd rolled and drunk past 3 a.m., the truck lurching, me teasing Ray he'd danced too hot, bet he'd spin us out. He'd smirked, parked sloppy, and we'd stumbled into the Oklahoma house, my head buzzing from beer and his vibe. In my skirt and top, I swayed in the hall, jacket off, flirty, saying he'd owned the night, bet he'd own me too. He smirked, kicked the door shut, tee tight, jeans low, muttering owning was my hustle, bet I'd crash it fast. I grinned, lurched closer, hip brushing his, teasing that crashing was my spark, bet he'd grab it. He grabbed my wrists, light, pulling me to his room, growling I'd pushed too far, bet I'd sink us. I laughed, flirty, bumped his chest, saying sinking was my rush, bet he'd dive in. He shoved the door open, hand brushing my arm, steering me in, muttering diving was my trap, bet I'd snag him. I flopped onto his bed, skirt shifting, teasing he looked wild, bet he'd catch me here. He dropped beside me, knee nudging mine, hands near my hips, light, growling catching was my miss, bet I'd twist him out. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying twisting was my vibe, bet he'd roll with it. He leaned in, hand brushing my waist, warm, muttering rolling was dumb, bet I'd tip us. I grinned, teased, saying tipping was my thrill, bet he'd steady me. Headlights flashed, Mom's voice roared, home early, yelling where we were. I froze, rolled off, yanking my top, heart slamming, muttering she's back, bet we're toast. Ray jumped up, cursing, saying timing sucked, bet she'd flip. Mom stormed in, bags crashing, eyes blazing, screaming why I was in his room, drunk? I stammered it was nothing, bet she'd blow it. She grabbed my arm, yelling at Ray he'd crossed it, get out, we're done. She hauled me to my room, stuffed my bag, shouting we're leaving, now. Ray said I'd sparked it, bet she'd see my fault, but she dragged me to the car, peeling out, leaving him in the dark. I slumped, buzz gone, knowing I'd lit it, I bet it burned us down.